My name's Charlotte Tottman. I'm what's called a psycho-oncologist, which is just sexy language for a clinical psychologist specialising in cancer-related distress. There aren't very many of us. I should hit my slide. There we are. There aren't very many people who do the work that I do. I can't work that out really because there's so much mental health stuff that goes on with a cancer diagnosis and treatment, and particularly with a metastatic situation. So I want to sort of, put it out there that I'm very aware that across Australia generally, it's pretty hard to get hold of a psychologist or a mental health professional. It's really hard to get hold of one if you're in a regional or remote area. So I really understand. I don't like that, but I imagine that I am making some assumptions, but I imagine that, probably most of the people in this room haven't had that opportunity. That's one of the reasons that I love doing the forums with BCNA, getting out into the regional areas, because this sort of presentation, it's not a substitute for therapy, but it's better than nothing. And at least I think it just starts some of the conversations that can be perhaps a bit more helpful and validates people's experience, lets people know that, like, if you are struggling, it's pretty normal, it's pretty understandable, and that even if you can't get to services, there are resources like my podcast, which I'll talk about a bit later, which can be a bit helpful and supportive. So I'm going to talk to you from three perspectives: from the theory of psycho-oncology, from my clinical practice, because I work 4 days a week, Monday to Thursday, 8 till 6, and I do all cancer work, so that's a lot of cancer stuff, and from my personal experience. I was diagnosed with early stage breast cancer in 2018, a long time after I started doing this cancer work. I don't know what it's like to live with metastatic disease. And I lost both my parents in my 20s, mum to ovarian and dad to bowel, and all four of my grandparents to cancer. So my family does cancer. We do it really well. Not something you want on your CV, but anyway. They're my contact details, and you can always get hold of me later. Like, I'll be floating around, and so if you want to reach out to me or find me online or whatever, I'm very accessible and available, and so they're there if you want them. Before I go any further, I just want to mention that, just a bit of a trigger warning, I'm going to cover some stuff that, frankly, probably all of you have thought about and felt about already more than once, but it might be triggering for you today. So if you do feel a bit shaken up by some of the material that I cover, please do reach out to someone that you trust later today or tomorrow and just have a bit of a debrief and say, gosh, I'm feeling a bit rattled and I wonder why that might be, and just download with someone just to make sure that, you stay safe in that space. I use this analogy, the stool analogy, not that other sort of stool, to describe why people might struggle with an ongoing cancer situation. You would all be expert in all of this stuff now. I'm not telling you much that you've never heard or thought of before, but I might just use some different language. Essentially, when you get a cancer diagnosis and when you're living with an extended situation with cancer, it doesn't just affect your physical health. It affects everything. So I use this analogy that your psychological well-being is a bit like the seat on a stool, okay? And the seat on the stool is supported by a number of legs. And normally for most people, those legs might be things like family, friends, hobbies and interests, work or study, physical health and healthy lifestyle behaviours. Now, when you get a cancer diagnosis and you're living with cancer, the legs on the stool can get taken away or they can get whittled away. So if you think that you had a nice, stable psychological well-being, well supported by all those legs, and then one at a time, the legs start to disappear, see what happens to the stool, the seat? It starts to tip. That's your psychological well-being. So if you feel a bit unstable some of the time, that's probably why. And I think sometimes just understanding that there's a really good reason why you might struggle and that it is normal. It's hideous, but it's normal. When I'm dealing with people who are living with metastatic disease, if they're not struggling, that's a bit weird. It's meant to be hard. It's an existential threat. This is about as hard as it gets. You're swimming in the deep end of the pool. So I think it's really important to have that validation and to understand that if you're struggling, it's awful but normal. Yeah? So This is the stuff I'm not going to talk about. It's a weird thing to talk about the stuff I'm not going to talk about, but I do this deliberately when I'm talking to people living with metastatic disease, because I want to make sure that you understand that I understand that living with metastatic disease is different to living with early breast cancer. I know you all know that, but I want you to know that I know that too. So when I do my next presentation in the next room, after this hour, these are the things I'm going to talk about in there. I'm going to talk about diagnosis shock, emotional isolation, relationship issues, body image concerns, a perspective shift, post-treatment adjustment difficulties, and fear of recurrence. Now, I could talk about quite a lot of those with you because probably most of you have had some experience with most of those since you were diagnosed, but we'd be here all day. So I think it would be much more doing honour to your situation if we talk about the stuff that is really specific to people living with metastatic disease. If you do want to hear more about that stuff, I'll tell you about the podcast at the end, so you can go and listen to that. So, common psychological issues in a metastatic cancer experience are the metastatic spectrum, I'll talk about that in a sec, living with uncertainty, fear of disease progression, which is similar but different to fear of recurrence, and mortality concerns. These are big things. These are meaty issues, yeah? These are not things that most people have to grapple with, and they don't tend to leave you alone for all that long. So the metastatic spectrum. This is this concept that I came up with a while ago because it occurred to me that in the population of clients that I see living with metastatic disease, it's a very broad range. I can see people from someone who may be dealing with one bone metastases, well managed, with endocrine therapy, living a pretty good life, able to work, able to function, all the way through to someone who has extensive metastatic disease, not responding to treatment, really facing mortality stuff quite soon. And yet they are described essentially as metastatic and everything in between. So it's a really broad spectrum. And so for people to kind of get their head around, like, well, what does that mean? How come you can look like you're kind of okay and you look like you're terribly, terribly unwell, and yet you both have the same thing? It's a really hard thing. And I think this plays into this concept called emotional isolation, which is essentially summed up by the words people don't get it. And so because human beings take in information through their eyes, if you look okay, if you sound okay, if you're mostly doing the stuff that you would be doing, then people make assumptions and they think, oh, she's all right, he's all right, they're all right. If you look really unwell, sure, they can make some conclusions, but even then they might not make the right conclusions because treatment can make you look terribly unwell. It doesn't actually mean that you might be facing the end of your life. You just might be really suffering from some punishing side effects. So this emotional isolation, I think, is exacerbated by the fact that in a metastatic context, a lot of people don't know what metastatic disease is. Even people, I'm sure you know, don't know how to say the word metastatic. I'm good at it because I say it all the time. But I was saying it the other day to someone and they were tripping over their tongue, and I was thinking, okay, how can I help them? And I came up with, this sounds weird, but I like it. I broke it down into two bits, meta and static. So meta made me think of Facebook, the company, and static made me think of electricity. So I think Facebook electricity is metastatic, yeah? So if you want to help somebody say the word metastatic, say Facebook electricity. Okay? But even that stuff, you know, it's like when someone gets your name wrong. If someone calls me Scarlett instead of Charlotte, it's like, I mean, I don't mind that much, but it's a little bit niggly. It's like if somebody can't say metastatic, it feels very emotionally isolating. It's like if you can't even say what's going on with me, how can you possibly understand what I'm going through? Yeah? The other part of the metastatic spectrum that is tricky is that if you're in it, if you're on the spectrum somewhere, on the metastatic spectrum, it can mean that we do this thing where we invalidate our own experience, where if I'm living at maybe the milder end of the metastatic spectrum, where my disease might be well managed, well under control, I might then go, oh, well, you know, it's not, my situation's not that bad. You know, I'm not as bad as those other people that I've met or those other people that I know about. Now, that's a very generous mindset, being able to see and have compassion for somebody else who's going through something that objectively might be worse than your situation. But if you do too much of that, it does this thing called invalidates your own experience. It basically says that what I'm going through isn't that bad, doesn't really count. I'm not allowed to complain. I'm not allowed to be unhappy or stressed or distressed about that. And that's problematic. So it's good to be able to do both sides of the coin. I have compassion. I see that there are other people who may be in more dire straits than me, but at the same time, I'm not having that much fun. And you're allowed to have both of those things going at the same time. Human beings don't do well holding more than one idea in their head at the time. We like simple, yeah? I'll just feel compassion, or I'll just feel pissed off that I've got metastatic disease, but trying to hold those two things together, that can feel like a lot. But if you can manage it, that's better. The other thing that's really helpful in the metastatic space, which again, I think you guys all know inside and out, is the value of empathy, going where you're understood, hanging out with, connecting with people who understand what you're going through, or as much as is possible given the circumstances. It might not be that they have exactly the same experiences, because frankly, who does? But, you know, the people in this room, there'd be a lot of empathy here. There'd be a shorthand in the conversations. There'd be an understanding when you look into someone's eye that they know what I'm talking about. I don't have to persuade you. I don't have to educate you. You get what this is like. And that is incredibly supportive, really helpful psychologically. And the reverse is true too, that if you're spending a lot of time with people who don't get what you're going through, it can be very damaging for you. So going where you're understood, reaching out to people who actually feel like they get your experience is a really good idea. And sometimes that might be in a community. Sometimes it might be through something like BCNA, where you actually connect into a huge online network of people across the country. One of the things I've observed with my population, my client base who live with metastatic disease, is that the meaning of special things changes. And that what used to be perhaps something that would be important and maybe joyful now has an edge. Everything has a side to it. So what would normally just make me happy, like going to my grandchild's birthday party or being at a special family event, now it can feel like I don't know how many more of these I'm going to have. Everything's got like an edge, a double meaning, yeah? And that's a big, heavy load to carry. And it's hard too, because at a lot of those sorts of events, there's a social expectation to kind of be, you know, positive and enjoying it and grateful to be here, yeah? Except that there's a whole like underbelly that maybe other people don't really see. And there's another thing that I call gratitude fatigue, which is when people feel, particularly if they've been living with metastatic disease for quite some time, or if they've had kind of unexpectedly good responses to treatment, where they sort of feel like I have to be grateful. I have to be grateful. I have to be so grateful that I'm still here, still suffering. And it's like, God, how hard is it to be grateful, to be dealing with something so enormous? I did an exercise with a client yesterday and we broke down the grateful stuff, and we managed to sort of separate it into two groups so that she could go, I am actually genuinely grateful for the medical care that I get access to in Australia, and I am genuinely grateful I'm still alive. But I am also actually quite sick of treatment, and I'm quite sick of the recurrences or the progression, yeah? And giving her the room to be able to express what she was genuinely grateful for, but also what she was not grateful for, what she's angry about, what she feels an injustice for, what she feels like she'd like to, you know, scream and shout about. That was much healthier for her. So sometimes in psychology, it's about teasing apart what we're going through and separating, you know, do I have to be grateful for everything? Can I give myself permission to be as unhappy as I really do feel in my heart about some of this stuff? You doing okay over there? Oh, yeah. I know you said you're a crier. Yeah. I did. Yeah. I buy tissues in bulk, so this happens with me all the time. So living with uncertainty. Humans don't do well with uncertainty. That's why the whole world struggled through coronavirus, because it plunged us into a situation where it was uncharted territory. People hadn't lived through a pandemic before. We were in a whole nother 100 years from the last pandemic. So we didn't have any data. We didn't have any lived experience. We didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know how it was going to play out. Certainty gives us a sense of security. It makes things feel safe and predictable. A sense of order brings anxiety down. So when you're living with uncertainty, in any context, but if you're living with uncertainty about the quality and the quantity of your life, that, like I said, is swimming in the deep end of the pool. That's a really hard thing to do. Yeah. Again, recognizing that there is a lot of stuff in your life that is uncertain, but not everything is uncertain, and there are some things that you can increase the certainty about. Having the tough conversations is one thing. Like I said, it might be about things like, what do I want as my life unfolds with metastatic disease? It might be, what do I want at the end of my life? It might be, what's important for me to convey to you for the time that I'm not there on the earth while you are. Dealing with personal admin's the other part of it. Personal admin is a lot of things, but when I'm talking with people with metastatic disease, everybody gets uncomfortable with this stuff. If we wait to get comfortable with it, we'll never do it. Wills, advanced care directives, end-of-life preferences, powers of attorney, all of those sorts of things, getting your personal stuff sorted. But what I say to people is, if you've got a partner, both of you do it. Don't just do it for the person who's living with metastatic disease, because that feels really heavy, feels really intense, feels like, mate, are we going down and pick the casket out next? It feels really raw. But if you do it for both parties, because truthfully, the reality is there's no guarantee that if you do have a partner that something couldn't happen to them, but it takes the heat out of it. It also means that you connect more about these issues, because if you're having to think about, well, if I was in a situation in hospital, would I want to move to a hospice or not? If your partner's having to think about those same sort of questions to fill in their advanced care directive, they're likely to have a more understanding response to your stuff. My husband is a clinical psychologist. How many psychologists can you have in the family? And our children would say too many. We did my stuff once I was diagnosed. I mean, we didn't think I was going to go on to a metastatic situation, but with my cancer history, it was all a bit unknown. Anyway, I said to him, we need to do my stuff, but if we're going to do my stuff, we're going to do your stuff too. And we did it. It wasn't that much fun. I mean, I'm not going to say it's a barrel of laughs, but all that paperwork is now done. It's in a file, it's in the safe, it's sorted. I don't have to go and do it again. I mean, if I live a long time, I might have to go and do it again, but it's done now. So it's not one of those things you have to keep doing, but once you've done it, it can actually bring relief, because it can feel like, okay, I've now made sure, with as much control as I can, that the stuff I want to happen is going to have the best chance of happening. And that actually can relieve distress and anxiety, but it can also be incredibly relieving for your loved ones, because as things unfold with a metastatic disease situation, stuff gets harder. People get more distressed. People get tired. And so there will often never be a better time to have those tough conversations than now. It's unlikely to get easier. So to be able to actually do some of that stuff isn't just going to be good for you guys, it's probably going to be really good for your family. And like I said, I've seen it play out both ways, where people do or people don't, or people try and do it too late. And the time that it is best for everyone is sooner. So that's kind of covered that. When I've just noted down there, when I say express, some of this stuff, the tough conversations, can be verbal. Yeah. But if you feel like talking about this stuff, just overwhelms you with emotion, sometimes it can be helpful to write stuff down, and that helps you clarify your thinking. And sometimes it can be doing stuff with people. Yeah. So it doesn't all just have to be tough conversations. Increasing perceptions of control, again, can offset some of the anxiety of living with uncertainty. So focusing on stuff that you can control, setting short-term goals, things that have purpose and meaning, and things where you can see almost the end before you start. So something that might take 3 months to complete. So it feels like when I'm beginning it, I can already see the end in sight. That feels doable. It feels manageable. Those sorts of activities are different for everyone. You know, for some people it might be I'm going to read all of the Harry Potter books. For somebody else it might be like I'm going to plant a vegetable garden. For somebody else it might be like I'm going to write my experience of cancer down to share with my family members. It could be different things. But thinking about something that has value and purpose and meaning for you and setting it as a little project can make you feel more like you are moving through life rather than kind of going around in the same space. Andrea Smith, who Vic mentioned before, who's done all the excellent research on helping people living with metastatic disease be seen, talked to me a while ago about one of the things that she finds really challenging. And I called it the thin pink line, and what it refers to is, she said every time she has a progression, she really falls apart again. And she's quite frustrated by that because she feels between the progressions, she sort of gets her mojo back and she starts to feel like, okay, I've got this. I know what I'm doing. I've got some energy, got getting back to my research or my work. I'm out and about a bit more. And I feel like actually, the foundation is getting a bit thicker. And then she said, but then I get hit with another progression and it's like snakes and ladders. It's like I've just gone right back down again. And I've reflected on that, and this is a gruesome analogy, but the thing about, I think, being hit with another progression, like I said, this is a hideous analogy, but on diagnosis, if somebody pulls a gun in your face, it sets off that panic, that fight and flight. And I feel like a disease progression, it's like somebody pulls a gun in your face again. It doesn't get any easier the second time or the third time or the 10th time. It's not meant to, because your system is being told, we have an existential threat. It is a really big deal. And so I think that, again, it's helpful. There's not sometimes much you can do about it except appreciate that this is normal and understandable. And that if you're feeling that sense of frustration when there's a progression, it's more about going, okay, here we are again. Done this before. I can get back up again. I can recover. I can build back up again because I've done it before. And there's this good saying in psychology, which is past behaviour best predicts future behaviour. So if you've navigated it once, you can navigate it again. I'm not saying it's easy, but you can do it. I'm mindful of time, and I haven't really talked in detail about fear of disease progression, but I think I've made the key point, which is that it is different to fear of recurrence. And you can use your fear as a motivator. So instead of feeling like there's a whole lot of things that cancer is taking away from me, and I appreciate that with metastatic disease and the metastatic spectrum, this is different for everybody because your physical self may vary tremendously from one person to another. But things like exercise, sleep and nutrition, using your fear to motivate you to pay attention to those things will help you cope psychologically the best you can with this insidious disease.